On the dark streets of Paris, a killer searches for victims.
He was like an eagle surveying his prey. He was hunting.
Young women are plucked from the streets.
They were all intelligent, vibrant, full of life.
He traps them in their cars or forces his way into their homes.
Once she opens the door, it becomes violent. The girl is a prisoner.
He eludes the authorities at every turn.
We hadn't succeeded in arresting the killer. There was a feeling of failure in the investigations.
For 6 years, the killer terrifies the city.
Everybody in Paris was afraid. It was very dangerous to go out at night.
Guy Georges, the beast of the Bastille. On the 19th of March 2001 at the Palais de Justice in central Paris, an ordinary-looking man in a baggy grey top was led into a crowded court. As the man sat down, his face broke into a devious smile. One of the most notorious serial killers in the history of France. It had been 3 years since his capture, and Parisians were anxious to get a glimpse of the man known as the Beast of the Bastille.
It was a shock to see him on the television, the smiling face of this powerful assassin.
Guy Georges was a 38-year-old drifter who raped and killed 7 young women between 1991 and 1997. In the courtroom, the cameras were turned off before Georges gave his first statement. The evidence in this case has nothing to do with me. But as the trial progressed, the evidence against Georges was overwhelming. DNA collected from several crime scenes, as well as eyewitness accounts from a few lucky survivors. On the witness stand, Georges finally confessed to all 7 murders. The chilling details of his crimes exposed the mind of a man obsessed with the hunt, a merciless killer who existed on the fringes of Parisian society. Paris, a beacon of culture and timeless beauty. But the City of Lights has always had a thriving alternative scene. At the time, many artists, bohemians and next-generation hippies lived in communal squatted housing for little or no rent. In 1991, Guy Georges easily blended into this community.
The girls in the squats liked him. He seemed like a very normal person, and he wasn't aggressive.
But Georges was hiding an alter ego. At night, he became obsessed with hunting attractive young women. Georges could easily disappear into Paris's bustling nightlife. He would sometimes enjoy a drink at one of the city's famous cafes as he watched beautiful women stroll past.
He has a sort of radar that responds to prey from a similar social prototype. A woman who was beautiful, radiant, and who, other than attacking her, he would never approach.
Dr. Daniel Zagari, a criminal psychiatrist who studied Georges, likened him to a vampire.
He was able to perceive their vitality, their zest for life. That vitality was lacking in him, and he tried to suck it out of them and incorporate that in himself.
Georges chose his prey carefully, sometimes following them through the streets of Paris for 2 or 3 hours before moving in for the kill. It was the excitement of the chase that drove him. His first crimes were physical assaults against women and then rape. He was arrested and imprisoned several times, but as French law does not impose tougher punishment for repeat offenders, Georges was usually paroled after serving only part of his sentence. In time, Georges' need for violence and domination led him to murder.
He had a kit, a killer kit. He walked the streets of Paris with a backpack. In his backpack he had adhesive tape to gag his victims and to tie up their hands and legs. And he also had a knife, an Opinel number 12. It's the knife that Guy Georges used to kill his victims.
On the 24th of January, 1991, Guy Georges was sitting at a cafe in the Montparnasse section of Paris when a 19-year-old student, Pascal Escoffier, walked by.
Pascal was a very charming girl, not very big, small, but very, very handy, very charming. She was studying at that time at the faculté, at the Sorbonne, and she was studying French literature.
Georges was attracted to the beautiful young woman. According to Georges, it was really not a sexual impulse that made me act like that. I had been with prostitutes just before, so I cannot say what force was guiding me. Georges followed her back to her apartment on the Rue de l'Ambre in the 14th arrondissement, or district. He came up beside her and showed her his knife. Escoffier asked, "What do you want?" The killer replied, "You." Georges forced his way into her flat and tied her hands with adhesive tape. He used his knife to cut off her clothes, then raped her.
Ce ne sont pas des crimes.
These weren't sexual crimes, no matter what anyone says. The fundamental experience for Guy Georges was an experience of total power. It was an experience of domination.
After the attack, Georges left Escoffier tied up as he rummaged through her home. She gave him a kick. In a cold retelling of the events, Georges said, "That made me mad, so I gagged her with the adhesive tape. I was sure that from the beginning I had the intention of killing her without knowing really why. I pushed her back on the bed and cut her throat." Before leaving with some stolen items, Georges drank a beer from her fridge.
He's in his domain, or to put it in an animal way, marking his territory. He smokes a cigarette, he has something to eat, and drinks a can of beer or has fruit. He makes himself at home.
At 3 a.m., Pascal's father, Jean-Pierre, received a phone call. The police informed him that his daughter had been murdered.
When Pascal was killed, the first phase was very, very tough, and I was like, how do you say, une autruche qui met la tête dans le sable.
For Guy Georges, it was a turning point. It was his first kill.
Et le premier crime va être la matrice.
The first crime is the mother of the crimes that follow. The first crime is an overwhelming, transforming experience that leads you to the following crimes. The killer discovers in himself something that was completely unknown to him before.
This calling would drive Georges to slaughter more young women, sending a wave of panic through the French capital. In February 1991, weeks had passed since the murder of 19-year-old student Pascal Escoffier in the 14th arrondissement. The police had no leads.
We had nothing, and so the chief inspector said to me, it's a very difficult case, and we find him only if he do the same again.
28-year-old Guy Georges had every intention of killing again, but for the moment he was locked in Caen prison, 143 miles from Paris. At the time of Escoffet's murder, Georges was on parole after serving a 6-year sentence for sexually assaulting a 22-year-old woman with a knife in 1984. When he didn't check in with the authorities as part of his parole, he was arrested and put behind bars. But no one suspected him in the Escoffet murder case. From 1991 to 1994, Georges was in and out of jail on charges ranging from assault to robbery. Each time he was released, he went back to the hunt.
He always felt like he was lacking something, like children who are always needy. He was like people who feel that they have to take from others. He always felt deprived, so he began his life of criminal violence.
For Guy Georges, this violence began in childhood. Georges was born Guy Rampignon in the town of Vitry-le-François on the 10th of October 1962. He was the illegitimate child of a black US serviceman and a white French woman. From birth, he was an embarrassment to his mother's family. She was unwilling to keep the baby, so she gave Guy up when he was just a toddler. The state changed his name to Georges, his birth father's first name, to hide the identity of his biological family.
What's most notable about the life of Guy Georges was that he was a child whom nobody wanted.
In 1968, 6-year-old Georges went to live with the Morin family and their 5 foster children in Angers.
He grew up in a very normal atmosphere. He wasn't a boy who was beaten or badly treated, but he was a child who didn't know his biological parents.
Guy described his foster family. They liked me and I was touched. I was the only black child, and that made me stand out. But Georges soon displayed the first signs of aggressive behavior. At 10, he stole a knife and discovered his love for hunting in the forests surrounding Angers.
He didn't take pleasure in cruelty to animals. He took pleasure in hunting alone. So, we make an analogy between hunting an animal and hunting a young woman. We can say that what was most exciting was the moment of the chase.
It wasn't until he was 14 that Guy Georges became violent towards people. In November of 1976, Guy tried to strangle his mentally handicapped foster sister. The girl survived without injury. His parents reprimanded him, but nothing more was done. 2 years later, he lashed out against another sister, this time using an iron bar. The young girl was badly injured, but managed to escape by biting him. After the second attack, the Morins were frightened for the safety of their other children. They decided to put 16-year-old Georges back into state care. He was crushed. For the second time in his life, he had been rejected by his family.
Why does one become a serial killer? There is always something enormous in the life of the subject. For Guy Georges, it's abandonment. And this abandonment leads to an enormous hate.
Guy nurtured that hatred in a state-run children's home. On the 6th of February 1979, at the age of 16, Georges followed a young woman from a bus stop in Angers. He stalked her into the woods, pushed her to the ground, and tried to strangle her. The woman managed to get away, and Georges served 1 week in prison.
The evolution of his criminal acts showed what is unfortunately characteristic to all serial killers. there is something inside that is trying to find a way of surfacing. This thing emerges then with the first crime, and then continues to come out with the repetition of each crime.
In 1981, Georges moved to Paris. In November of that year, aged 19, Georges attacked again. This time he raped a woman in the basement of her building. He stabbed her and left her for dead, but she managed to drag herself to safety. Georges served just 5 months in prison.
He was constantly in and out of prison, constantly, because he started aggression very early in his life. First a small aggression and then stronger and stronger.
As his need for violence grew, his crimes became more horrific. Once the streetlights flickered on, the young women of Paris became his prey. In early January, he made his move. He spotted 27-year-old Catherine Rocher leaving her car in an underground car park in the 12th arrondissement. As she locked her car, he approached from behind, wielding a hunting knife. Georges forced Rocher into her car, cut her clothes off with the knife, and raped her. He then stabbed her to death. He dumped the body on the pavement and walked off into the night. Rocher's body was discovered the next day. The police combed the area for clues. There were many similarities between this killing and Georges' first murder of Pascal Escoffier. In both cases, the victims' clothes were cut off. They were raped and then killed with a knife.
It's these gestures that are practically identical in all of the crimes. He cuts their neck and he sticks them with a knife in the places where he knows they'll bleed more. He stabs them in the chest.
He kills them with an extreme violence. One could see on the bodies of some of the victims the vertebrae broken by the knife, but with other wounds you could see they were just done for torture, not for killing.
But investigators on the Catherine Rocher case didn't make the connection between the two murders. In November of 1994, 9 months after Rocher's murder, Georges attacked a woman in another garage in the 13th arrondissement. His target was 22-year-old Elsa Benedy.
She was tall and thin, and she smiled a lot. She was very charming, and she was able to charm. Of course, I'm very prejudiced, but I think she was very pretty.
Benedy had just been to visit her mother, who was getting ready to fly to Canada.
The day before I left, she came to visit me. Every time one member of the family left for a trip, we'd get together for dinner. Elsa couldn't come to dinner this time, but she came to say goodbye to me. I remember very clearly the moment that she hugged me and said goodbye. It's a very special memory.
Benedy returned home, expecting to see her mother again soon. On the 9th of November, Benedy walked to her car in the underground car park. Georges followed.
A killer gets a lot of pleasure from looking for the victim, following the victim, up until committing the act.
Guy approached and asked Benedy for the time. She rolled down the window, and Georges forced his way into the car. She was raped and murdered in the same manner as Catherine Rocher and Pascal Escoffier. Benedy's mother was in Canada when she heard about her daughter's death. She immediately returned to Paris.
Afterward, when I got back to Paris, my children learned that their sister was dead, so I had to console them. So even though I felt dead, I had to go on living.
A special team was set up to investigate the garage murders. Once again, investigators failed to link them to the murder of Pascal Escoffier back in 1991. To the police, the attacks appeared to be unrelated. Escoffier's murder occurred 3 years before the first garage murder and took place in a flat. 1 month later, on the night of the 9th of December, the killer struck again. This time, Georges went back to his old method and followed the woman into her home. The victim's name was Agnes Niekamp, a 33-year-old Dutch woman living in the 11th arrondissement. Guy Georges followed her into her courtyard building and up the stairs. He forced his way into her flat, raped her, then stabbed her. Later, Guy Georges recalled, "I don't know what made me kill this woman. She didn't cry, she didn't hit me, she didn't try to run away. I can't explain why I killed her." Another team of officers was established to investigate the 2 flat murders. But this team had a lead the other didn't: a semen sample taken from the body of Agnes Niekamp. Georges usually carried condoms in his killer kit, but had not used one in this attack. Police had a sample of his DNA, but it was little help in their investigation. At the time, the French government placed tough restrictions on the use of DNA in criminal investigations. By law, a person could be convicted based on DNA evidence, but using that person's DNA to try and link them to other crimes was seen as a violation of an individual's rights. For this reason, France did not have a DNA database, and there was no efficient way to compare DNA evidence from different crime scenes. This made identifying repeat offenders difficult and time-consuming.
There wasn't a law that dealt precisely with the use of genetic encoding. The idea of a database, like those that exist in the US or England, was not a common thing.
As a result, Georges' DNA was not compared to evidence from other crimes. This vital clue sat in storage. For investigators, the chase was still on. They wanted to catch Guy Georges before he struck again. In Paris in 1995, the police believed that 2 different killers were loose in their city. 2 women had been brutally raped and murdered in their homes, and 2 others raped and killed in underground garages. Separate groups of investigators were combing the streets of Paris for suspects. One team of officers focused on the flat murders, while another group hunted for the garage killer.
They didn't really share their information between them. Each worked in their own group and on their own side.
The flat team had physical evidence left by the killer, a semen sample taken from Agnes Niekamp's body. But government restrictions on the use of DNA evidence hampered detectives. The sample was kept in storage and the investigation stalled. Then in June of 1995, there was another attack and a potential breakthrough in the case. An attractive 23-year-old woman named Elizabeth Ortega called the police after escaping from a man carrying, quote, the sort of knife you use to debone a leg of lamb. She told investigators that she had given a man a cigarette, then he forced her into her flat at knife point. Her hands were tied to her bed, but she was able to break free and leap from a window. Detectives on the flat murder cases suspected that Ortega's attacker was the killer they'd been searching for. They asked her to give them a detailed description. Ortega was still in shock, and the information she gave was not very accurate. She described the attacker as roughly 25 years old, with a dark complexion, oval face, and fine features. The police produced a computer-generated image based on her descriptions, but the picture didn't resemble Georges. They began searching for the man in the sketch, while Georges continued to walk the streets of Paris. There was only one other piece of evidence from the Ortega assault that could help investigators: a cigarette butt left by the attacker. That clue was sent to a private lab, where the DNA was stored. 1 month after the attack, the killer struck again. In July of 1995, a 27-year-old woman, Hélène Franquin, was attacked and killed in her flat in the 10th arrondissement. The police were able to retrieve yet another DNA sample from semen collected at the scene. They decided to hire a private lab to compare this sample against the 2 other samples they had in storage. It wasn't standard procedure, but investigators believed it was worth the risk. The DNA evidence was sent to a lab run by Dr. Olivier Pascal. The samples taken from the attacks on Agnes Niekamp and Hélène Franquin were then compared with DNA found on the cigarette butt in Elizabeth Ortega's home.
The sperm found in the 2 murders had the same genetic profile. The same person killed these 2 young women. There was a 3rd attempt where the victim escaped. We extracted DNA from a cigarette butt found at the crime scene. We found the same genetic code. This is when the investigators knew for sure that we were dealing with a serial killer.
They could prove that the flat murders had been committed by the same man. But without a national DNA database, there was no effective way for investigators to compare these samples with DNA evidence from other investigations. News that a deranged murderer was attacking women in their homes hit the press.
This case generated an enormous pressure on Paris. Women were afraid to go out at night. There was a general fear all over France.
That same month, a high-ranking judge, Bastille, was brought in to assist the flat murder cases. In France, judges often prepare dossiers on urgent criminal investigations.
A serial killer kills over a period of time. Psychological and psychiatric research has shown that that type of killer doesn't ever stop. With a serial killer, if we don't gather enough evidence against him to convict him, there will be other victims.
It had been 2 months since the last attack. Judge Thiel and Inspector Martine Montet suspected the murders had stopped because the killer was locked up somewhere. They began searching prison records for any convicts who had committed crimes similar to the flat murders. In fact, 2 months earlier, Georges had been arrested for robbery and sentenced to 30 months in jail. But due to an inexplicable oversight, the investigators did not turn up Georges' record.
We started looking through the records of psychiatric hospitals, neighborhoods, and jails. We found nothing.
However, around the same time, the team investigating the garage murders did discover Georges. They were combing through prison records and noticed that a prisoner named Guy Georges had a history of violence against women and pulled him from his cell for questioning. They asked him to give blood for a DNA test. Georges agreed. The police planned to compare the samples against a small bloodstain they had found in one of the victims' cars. They didn't know if the blood was from the killer or not, but decided to compare it to Georges' to be sure. It didn't match. It never occurred to the investigators that the DNA from Guy Georges could match DNA from other crime scenes.
We never compared the DNA of Guy Georges with the DNA found in the apartment murders. It was about two different groups of investigations. No one thought about comparing the samples, not even us.
A DNA database would have made it possible for the police to compare Georges' DNA to all other samples in the system. Without it, police were missing a crucial tool, and Guy Georges was able to continue his hunt. After 4 years, both teams had reached a dead end. They had not linked the crimes and were running out of options. With no new leads, officers from the two teams began sharing information. They showed Guy Georges' picture to survivor Elizabeth Ortega, but she didn't recognize him. Once again, the police were stumped.
There was a feeling of failure in both investigations. We hadn't succeeded in arresting the killer.
Out on the streets, Guy Georges was looking for his next victim. In Paris in June 1997, Guy Georges had just finished serving 2 years in prison for assaulting a young woman. The police didn't know that Georges was also a serial killer, responsible for murdering 5 women over the last 6 years. Investigators had collected DNA from 3 of the crime scenes, but French law placed strict limitations on the use of DNA evidence. For this reason, the police didn't compare the samples against DNA Guy Georges had already given to a different investigation. As their search continued, Georges began looking for a fresh kill. In late 1997, 2 more young women were raped and murdered in their homes, Magali Siroti and Estelle Magde. Both women were young and pretty, and both were killed in the same manner. Their clothes cut off them, their hands tied. News of the 2 new murders had Parisians in a frenzy. The press called the killer the Beast of the Bastille, the area where he stalked some of his victims.
Everybody in Paris was afraid at this time, because it was very dangerous to go out at night.
Finally, Judge Thiel took a bold step. He ordered all the country's labs to share genetic information. He believed it was the only way to catch the killer and stop the murders.
This was a very controversial thing. This was not our usual way of conducting ourselves.
DNA expert Dr. Olivier Pascal compiled 3,500 DNA samples from his lab. He compared each one with the evidence found at the murder scenes. Finally, on the 23rd of March 1998, his lab had a breakthrough.
I called up Judge Thiel. I have 2 bits of news. One is good and one is bad. The good news is we have found the individual. We know who he is.
The bad news was devastating. The killer was Guy Georges. His volunteered DNA had been in evidence for almost 3 years, but police hadn't compared it to DNA from the murders.
It was a really difficult moment, because we knew that if we had discovered this from the moment we had him, 2 young women would still be alive. Judge Thiel and I carry on our conscience the death of these 2 girls.
After 7 years, the Beast of the Bastille had finally been identified. Martine Montet and the Parisian police force leapt into action.
From the moment Guy Georges was identified, I immediately brought together all of the groups that were following this case. We organized the chase to catch him.
Montet distributed over 3,000 photos of Guy Georges.
We worked night and day distributing these photos everywhere in France.
The squats where Guy Georges slept were staked out, as well as the shelters where he received his post. The entire force was mobilized.
Et partout, nous avons mis des hommes. Si vous voulez,
we put men on this everywhere because we really didn't know where he was. He didn't have a fixed residence. We searched everywhere, in the capital, in the countryside, everywhere he might have a place to hide.
Guy Georges was now the one being hunted. On the 24th of March 1998, Georges was spotted coming up the steps of a metro station in northwestern Paris.
There were two investigators in Paris who grabbed him at the exit of the Blanche metro station. They immediately recognized him and arrested him.
Georges put up little resistance, and the police quickly arrested him. They discovered that he'd been carrying a knife, but the beast of the Bastille was finally captured.
After his arrest, he was brought to the criminal brigade. We were waiting for him. We'd spent years looking for him. All the investigators wanted to get a good look at Guy Georges, the monster who had killed all these young women.
Montey and her team interrogated Georges, but he only confessed to 2 of the crimes. It was enough to put him on trial for murder.
We couldn't invent the details that he gave us. He confirmed the evidence that we already had. He was able to describe the crime scenes and what happened, and confirmed he committed the crimes.
Dr. Daniel Zagary was one of the psychiatrists who interviewed Georges. He was horrified when Georges described how killing made him feel powerful.
He only said this to me. At that moment, I was the boss. Guy Georges said that in English. I am the boss.
But it would take more than his confession to link Georges to all 7 murders in a court of law. And even with the evidence against him, there was still a chance that Guy Georges could be freed. On the 19th of March 2001, after a 7-year killing spree, Guy Georges had finally been captured and was standing trial for his crimes. Accused of murdering 7 young women between 1991 and 1997. As the trial began, people in the courtroom came face to face with the man known as the Beast of the Bastille.
From the first time you could see Guy Georges standing on the witness stand, you would expect to see his power, his strength, the devil. But instead, Guy Georges was very charismatic. He was a good-looking guy.
Georges had already confessed to 2 of the murders, but on the first day of the trial, he withdrew his confession, claiming that he was innocent. This was especially painful for the families of the victims.
And it was, I think, making a game in front of families who lost their daughter. It was really stupid and not fair.
As the trial moved forward, Dr. Daniel Zagary was asked to give a character analysis based on his interview with Georges. Zagary told the court that Georges' violence was directly related to his childhood and his intense desire for control.
He was able to transform this initial experience of abandonment and extreme suffering into the complete opposite experience. He went from being a child who suffered to being the one who made others suffer. He was dominated and became the person who dominated. Therefore, he transformed his distress into feelings of grandeur and omnipotence.
Alors on dit en français démiurgique, c'est-à-dire la toute-puissance d'un dieu.
Each day of the trial was devoted to a different victim. On the day the court discussed the murder of Pascal Escoffier, her father, Jean-Pierre, couldn't bring himself to face the crime scene evidence.
I refused to look at the photo, and so I went out to brace a little bit.
On the day the court focused on Elsa Benedi's crime scene evidence, her mother was horrified by Georges' behavior.
Il regardait les photos.
He looked at the photos, just like he would have looked at any photos. He didn't have any expression on his face.
Angered, Benedi asked the court if she could speak directly to Guy Georges.
Because the defense said he was like this because he was an adopted child, I asked him, "Did you love your mother?" "Well, in front of you. You have the mothers of your victims." I didn't cry, because I wasn't going to cry in front of him. He said, "Yeah, it must be really hard." But he didn't have any regrets.
Et il me dit oui, ça doit être dur. Il n'avait aucun regret.
By the second week of the trial, the evidence against Guy Georges was overwhelming. He decided to change his plea. He admitted on the stand to killing all 7 young women. For some of the family members, it was a relief.
I looked at him and I said, he will no longer be an enemy of children.
On the 5th of April 2001, Guy Georges was sentenced to life in prison, with a chance of parole after 22 years, the maximum sentence possible. Although Judge Thiel and Martine Montet think it is unlikely Georges will ever be released, the parents of the victims felt the law should be changed to guarantee a life sentence.
En prison, il se tient très bien.
In prison, he conducts himself well, and there is a risk that he will get a judge who isn't familiar with his story. Once he's done 22 years, they'll let him go. We should do like they do in the United States. 22 years for each girl. He would never get out.
For DNA expert Dr. Olivier Pascal and Judge Gilbert Thiel, the case of Guy Georges will haunt them for the rest of their lives.
If we only had a little luck, been a little better, and also if we had had a DNA database at our disposal, Guy Georges would have been identified and arrested in 1995. So there were 2 innocent victims that paid the price.
I will always have those 2 girls on my conscience. It was the law that stopped the police from going further. Sometimes you have to go outside the law to save a life.
Across Paris, families and friends continue to mourn the loss of the 7 young women who were plucked from the streets by Guy Georges. But Benedi's mother doesn't want her family to be beaten by the death of Elsa.
The other children must live, and must live the best possible life. It was very hard because we're not free of the death of Elsa. But this is part of life. You must continue, and you must advance.
Jean-Pierre Escoffier will never let go of the memory of his daughter, Pascal.
I think her legacy is fight.
The case of Guy Georges exposed the need for a national DNA database in France. In 1998, it was put into place. As for the beast of the Bastille, those who analyze the serial killer know that he must never be set free.
What Guy Georges says, like many serial killers, is how fortunate it is that they arrested me, because for sure I would have done it again.